Ebola hearing. U.S. lawmakers evaluate America's strategy to contain the deadly virus. News from the Synod. Bishops have a few more days to fine-tune a document on marriage and family. Facing their past. Former American POWs visit Japanese prison camps where they were held during the Second World War. And Restoration's celebration. The Vatican marks 20 years since Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel were restored. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, October 16th, 2014. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Tough questions today, but few answers as America's response to the Ebola crisis is under serious scrutiny here in Washington. Susanne LaFrankie reports from Capitol Hill tonight. Suzanne?
Good evening, Brian. The Republican-controlled House committee is continuing to hold the Obama administration's feet to the fire over what they are saying are obvious lapses in the government's response to the Ebola virus here in the U.S. The committee wants answers, and they're also calling for a ban on travel.
Do you swear the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Congress members grilled health officials on Capitol Hill today, with one saying the Ebola cases demonstrated failures in the government's response.
This is the question the American public is asking. Why are we still allowing folks to come over here, and why, once they're over here, is there no quarantine?
Our fundamental mission is to protect Americans. Right now, we're able to track everyone who comes in.
But you're not stopping them from being around other people, Doctor.
Officials from the CDC and NIH testified that they still don't know how 2 Dallas nurses caught Ebola from a Liberian man who died earlier this month. The revelation that one of the nurses was cleared to fly by the CDC the day before she was diagnosed further raised concerns. Many on the committee are calling for President Obama to use his executive powers to create a no-fly zone, preventing flights from West Africa.
We need to send the signal now. Our border is closed.
This afternoon, the White House press secretary continued to echo the president's message that Americans are safe.
People can take some solace in understanding that the risk of a widespread Ebola outbreak in the United States is exceedingly low.
Today, there was mixed reaction to the Ebola outbreak from tourists visiting the nation's capital.
There's just too much widespread panic, but they'll get it under control.
Well, what I've done this whole time is I've just said a lot of prayers and said, God, it's in your hands, and I'm just trusting in what you have for us.
Late word this afternoon that the president has signed an executive order allowing the Pentagon to call up troops from the National Guard if necessary. Brian, back to you.
All right, our chief White House correspondent, Susanne LaFrankie, at Capitol Hill tonight. And the 2 U.S. nurses with Ebola are being transferred for their care. Nina Pham, the first nurse to catch Ebola in the U.S., has been flown here to the National Institutes of Health just outside Washington. And the second nurse, Amber Joy Vinson, is being transferred to Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, where 2 other victims were treated earlier. In Spain, there's concern over 4 new possible Ebola cases. One patient was taken by ambulance to a hospital after experiencing fever and shivering on an Air France flight that landed in Madrid. Another possible case involves a person who has a fever after coming in contact with an infected nursing assistant in Spain. The third involves a missionary who is returning to Spain from Liberia, and the fourth is a Red Cross worker who recently returned from Sierra Leone. The World Health Organization says the Ebola death toll will rise to more than 4,500 this week, with twice that number infected by the virus. Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. The Vatican releases a new English translation of a document on family life that bishops from around the world are drafting in Rome. A section initially entitled "Welcoming Homosexuals" is now "Providing for Homosexual Persons." The first version asked if the church was capable of welcoming these people, guaranteeing to them a fraternal space in our communities. The new version asks the church is capable of providing for these people, guaranteeing them a place of fellowship in our communities. The first version said homosexual unions can often constitute a precious support in the life of the partners. The new version says gay unions often constitute valuable support in the life of these persons. A Vatican spokesman says English-speaking bishops had requested the changes, arguing that the initial translation was hasty and error-ridden. We're joined from Rome by Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana. Your Eminence, thanks for joining us. We've heard there's been quite a bit of heated debate at the Synod today. Can you tell us what the bishops are discussing?
Today in particular, there wasn't much of a debate. It was just that the different groups presented, the report of their workshop group. And there was a little bit of discussion about whether to make it public or not. And then, the consensus and the general feeling was that it should be made public, since this corresponds with the atmosphere and the mood set by the Holy Father right at the beginning of the Synod.
Well, certainly the release of the Relatio earlier this week, and since then a few minor revisions of the English translation, some faithful Catholics feel that the language doesn't accurately reflect church teaching. What would you say about that?
I think it's going a little bit too far to say that the language doesn't reflect church teaching. In any case, this is part of the discussion. This is part of the ongoing discussion. What is transpired up to this moment is different people coming from different, from the experiences of the different local churches, sharing their points of view. And the Relatio post Deceptationem had a task of trying to capture as many of those views as possible. So it doesn't quite reflect the view of the Synod or a decision taken on anything. It's just an attempt to capture as very many points of view and feeling from local churches as much as possible.
You will be releasing another document at the end of this week, and of course then there's a year of discussion before the next Synod finalizes some of what has gone on. We've heard that some of the African bishops feel like they've been sidelined. Do you think that you and other African bishops are being heard?
Oh, no. I've been speaking with several of them, and that is not the view that they have. In fact, I'm impressed by the fact that they so freely share their points of view and opinion in the Synod Hall. So the feeling is not that they sideline. I don't think that accurately present the position of the African participants at this Synod. I think they're pretty well listened to, and their views are pretty well taken on board.
Well, we've been following it from here in Washington, and I find this a very fascinating chapter in our church history. What about you being right in the middle of it?
For me, I'm very, very consoled by everything that is happening. The Holy Father did attend several of the meetings of the Synod committee even before we came to this Synod. And at the beginning of it, he encouraged all of us to speak plainly, clearly, and with a lot of courage, not be afraid of hurting his feeling by expressing anything, and then he exhorted us to listen to each other with great humility. And that's what we've tried to do, and that's what is facilitated, the free sharing of views in the Synod. And so some emphasis will be missed, and some other things will be drawn in. But I just ask the world and the press and the public to be patient and probably judge us from the message rather. The message will be our attempt to share something concrete from this Synod with the world. That's a more, if you want, permanent and abiding statement than the post what we've just listened to.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your view and your perception of everything that's going on and helping us to better understand. Your Eminence, Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana, thank you for joining us tonight.
Okay, thanks for your interest and thanks for listening to us. Thanks.
And former presidential candidate Michael Dukakis is defending one of the accused Boston Marathon bombers' friends. The former Massachusetts governor is friends with Robel Filippo's family. Prosecutors say Filippos lied to police about being present when evidence was destroyed during an intense manhunt for the bombing suspects. Filippo's defense claims that he was high on marijuana and doesn't clearly remember even being there. 3 people were killed and more than 260 injured in the twin bombings near the marathon's finish line, April 2013. Well, it was another day of emotional testimony in the sentencing hearing for Oscar Pistorius. Today, a cousin of the victim, Riva Steenkamp, told the court that Pistorius was not sincere in his apology to the family. The witness says he must pay for his actions. With testimony ending today, final arguments come tomorrow. The judge who will pronounce the sentence has no strict time frame to do so. The Olympic champion was acquitted of murdering his girlfriend, but found guilty of a lesser crime in causing her death. Experts don't believe last winter's brutal weather will be repeated this year. Federal forecasters say this winter should be fairly average. Warmer than normal temperatures are expected for most of the West, the northern tier, and northern New England. The southeast should be a bit cooler, and average temperatures are expected elsewhere. Forecasters predict wetter than normal conditions stretching from Southern California to Florida. Coming up, acting affords a certain freedom for California prison inmates. And Princeton law professor Dr. Robert George weighs in on Houston's approach to quieting church leaders. On Thursday, October 16th, Pope Francis tweets today, "A Christian is merciful by nature. This is heart of the gospel." Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Brian Patrick, and a group of Houston pastors say they won't back down from the fight for religious freedom. They've been subpoenaed by the city, told to hand over copies of their sermons. Wyatt Goolsby is here tonight with that story.
Brian, today lawyers representing those 5 pastors say the city of Houston has taken no concrete action to resolve their legal battle. In fact, they say the city is still bullying them. The dispute at its core is about Houston Mayor Annise Parker's administration supporting the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, or HERO. The law provides protections, including the right to use men or women's bathrooms, depending on which gender you identify with. The city's attorneys want to know if the pastors supported activists who are trying to add a repeal referendum to the ballot. So the city subpoenaed all speeches, presentations, or sermons related to the petition, the mayor, homosexuality, or gender identity. Yesterday, Mayor Parker said this is not an attempt to violate personal freedoms.
People are rightly concerned if a government entity tries to in any way inhibit religious speech. That is not the intent. And it certainly, actually, on its face, was not what was going to happen with this request.
The city of Houston also tells EWTN News Nightly the scope of the subpoenas is too broad. They say they will narrow the scope, focusing only on communications related to the petition process. But the Alliance Defending Freedom, who represent the pastors, say they are still moving forward with their motion to end those subpoenas. They say this is more than a request for sermons.
These pastors are not part of this lawsuit. This communication they are demanding that the pastors send over, their text messages, their emails, their sermons, have nothing to do with this lawsuit. So even if they narrow it, it's sort of irrelevant because the content of these pastors' private and public communication is absolutely irrelevant.
The Houston city attorney says the city doesn't intend to back down. He said the pastors made their sermons relevant to the case by using the pulpit to encourage church members to oppose the ordinance. Brian.
All right, thanks, Wyatt. Very interesting case. Robbie George is a professor of legal philosophy at Princeton University. He's joining us now to talk more about this. Robbie, what's the line between political activity and the pulpit?
Well, there is no line. When you're in the pulpit, you're allowed to say anything you want, at least under our Constitution. There's a statute from the Johnson administration that purports to put some limitations on the speech, even of ministers, if it's political speech, but that certainly hasn't been enforced against pastors in any kind of consistent way. We have a First Amendment in this country. It protects freedom of speech and it protects the free exercise of religion, both of which are implicated in cases like this. And politicians simply have no business invading that territory.
So you saw that subpoena and what they're asking for. Doesn't religious freedom protect those documents?
Of course it does. Imagine the outcry if this case were happening back in the early 1960s and it was the Reverend Martin Luther King who freely delivered his political message, a good message, a message for justice, to end segregation, and Southern segregationist politicians attempted to subpoena his sermons or his texts of religious and political speeches. We have a right to go into the public square and advocate for our religious views, for our political views on equal terms with other citizens. We have no greater right than secular citizens, but we have no lesser right.
So they say, okay, the subpoena was probably overly broad. Would narrowing it be the right answer?
Well, it doesn't seem to be aimed at anything other than harassing pastors who have a view different from the mayor's view. You know, the mayor has her own very strong view that men who claim to be or identify themselves as women should be able to use women's bathrooms and vice versa. The pastors disagree with that. They think that's a very bad thing, as indeed they should. And she's evidently, or her lawyers are trying to use muscle to intimidate these pastors and get them to back down from their position. That doesn't that's not on in this country. You're not allowed to do that. The mayor's going to lose. The mayor's going to lose this thing.
And of course, the pastors helped to organize this petition drive to vote on this. And thousands of the signatures on this petition were declared invalid. And now they're trying to, some of those people who signed are suing the city. What do you make of this, and how do you think that's going to turn out?
Well, of course, I don't know the details of which signatures are valid and which signatures are invalid. On these ballot initiatives, often there are debates about the validity of signatures. But I'll tell you this, the people who are advocating repeal and want the ballot initiative have every right to collect signatures, to speak out from pulpits or any place else in favor of their view. They have those ministers have exactly the same right Martin Luther King had. They have the same right that the ministers who led the abolition movement against slavery had. They have the same right that the ministers who advocated the American Revolution, the patriot ministers who were known as the black-robed militia, had. So the mayor's on a bad footing here, and she's going to lose, and the best thing she could do is back away from this and respect people's basic freedoms.
You make a strong case, Counselor. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Bobby George from Princeton. Well, prison is not the best place, usually, to freely express and explore emotions, but as Catherine Zeltner reports, a theater program for California inmates gives them the opportunity to do just that.
From the makeup to the warm-up to getting out the jitters, these amateur actors get ready to take the stage.
Everybody has a mask, right, that we wear every day when we're out there. When you come up in here, I mean, you're able to be yourself.
No, I'm gonna do my secret ritual. I love you, Isabella. I love you.
We get to choose these characters, and we see where we fit in.
And for many of these men, it's the first time they felt comfortable in their own skin. They're inmates at the California Rehabilitation Center in Norco. Christopher Bisbano is doing 23 years for attempted murder.
Everything in the world is right here in this room, right? We just create it with our imagination.
Now a pilot program will bring acting and dozens of other arts programs to prisons statewide.
The ones that have attended, they find something, and the other inmates, I think they see something in them different.
Actor Tim Robbins launched the Actors Gang Prison Project in 2007. And still coaches the inmates.
It gives them a way to focus their energies and to get in touch with emotional states that they've never felt in their life or were deemed inappropriate for a prison.
Say it like you mean it. Isabella!
The guys get to explore their emotions and be able to deal with them.
Including a freedom these men have found, even behind bars. Catherine Zeltner, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. In case you hadn't heard, there's a big baseball game tonight. Tonight's National League Championship Series game could decide who plays the Kansas City Royals in the World Series. The Giants lead the series 3-1. A San Francisco win over the Cardinals tonight would send the Giants to the World Series. Of course, last night the Royals beat the Orioles to take the American League Championship. The Royals, by the way, haven't played a World Series game since 1985. The 2014 World Series begins Tuesday, October 21st. Up next, as courts lean closer to redefining marriage, we discuss the role of traditional marriage in a stable society. It's Throwback Thursday, and on this day, St. John Paul II was elected Pope. It was October 16, 1978. He was the first non-Italian Pope since 1523. Thanks to patrons of the arts of the Vatican Museums who posted this photo on their Facebook page. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. I'm Brian Patrick, and in Alaska, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is blocking so-called same-sex marriage while the state asks the U.S. Supreme Court to restore its ban. If the High Court doesn't act, The block will be dissolved tomorrow morning, meaning same-sex ceremonies will move forward in Alaska. This comes after a U.S. district judge struck down Alaska's 15-year-old statute defining marriage as between a man and a woman. Sarah Torre is a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. She's focusing on religious liberty, marriage, and family in her work. Sarah, it looks like Alaska could be the next in line. So now about 30 states are allowing same-sex couples to marry legally, civilly. What does this mean to traditional marriage?
You know, the Supreme Court's decision last week not to hear some of the appeals in 5 states was really an unfortunate decision, not only for a healthy marriage culture, but also for constitutional self-government. In many of these states, the 30 that you mentioned, citizens have overwhelmingly, by a democratic process, affirmed marriage as the union of one man and one woman. And yet these federal courts have been allowed to usurp that authority and impose the redefinition of marriage on them. So this debate isn't over. Many governors and attorney generals in a number of other states can continue the legal fight to protect traditional marriage.
Do you see the High Court taking this issue up again, some of these cases, in this next year?
It's possible the Supreme Court could be waiting for the 6th or the 5th Circuit to make their decision in some of the marriage cases there. They may be waiting for a split circuit decision that way, so we'll just have to wait and see.
Let's look at traditional marriage and its contributions to a stable society. What does your research show?
Absolutely. Marriage is one of the least restrictive ways that we can connect children to their biological mother and father. So marriage is based on the biological reality that children need both a mom and a dad, and that's what reproduction requires. And so marriage brings the two halves of humanity together to be, for a man and a woman to be husband and wife, to be mother and father to any children that that union produces. And that's why the state cares about marriage, to connect children to their biological mom and dad, which is where they do best.
Let's look at the millennials. Where do they fall on this issue?
You know, this is a tough case, but I and many of my colleagues who are millennials believe in the truth about marriage. This is a case where Americans simply need to hear the case for marriage that I just laid out briefly. This isn't a case where marriage has been heard and found wanting. It just simply hasn't been heard. Excellent point.
And it seems like it's kind of risky as a CEO or a public figure to speak out about marriage. Look at the Mozilla CEO for a very short time. He stood up for California's ban on same-sex marriage, and that was the end of his career, at least with Mozilla. How has this issue affected our freedom of speech then?
You know, in many of these instances, there's a lot of cultural pressure and intimidation for people who speak out for marriage. But more concerning is when government forces or tries to force people to violate their beliefs about marriage. We've seen photographers, cake makers, florists who are involved in the wedding industry hauled into court simply because they don't want to violate their beliefs by participating in a same-sex wedding ceremony. So we need to be ready, even as states redefine marriage, to protect the religious liberty of Americans to continue speaking and living out the truth about marriage.
Indeed. Sarah Torre with the Heritage Foundation, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
And former American POWs visit the Japanese prison camps where they were held during World War II. These 3 men who are now in their 90s toured a former prison camp. They say they remember stealing food to survive, working in labor camps, and watching American bombers fly overhead on their way to Tokyo. Oral Nichols says he was forced to work in a mine during the war and was determined to survive.
I was young and had set myself a goal to live. I was going to live regardless.
The veterans also met with Japanese lawmakers and the U.S. ambassador to Japan. There were about 30,000 Allied POWs held in prison camps across Japan during the war. Well, until tomorrow, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. We leave you tonight with a virtual visit to the Vatican's Sistine Chapel, marking 20 years since the restoration of Michelangelo's frescoes, now seen in a new light. Good night, and God bless you.